the idea is obviously for us to digest a lot of the things that we've discussed today. And so I think what I'll try to do is talk for a few minutes, probably be irresponsible in certain things that I say because I'm completely improvising, and then just leave a few moments for all of us to either ask each other questions, make a few comments before we go. What I think, just sitting and listening to everyone over the course of the past day and a half, I kept going back to the name of this conference, so in particular the term rethinking. All of us, I think, agree that Ukrainian studies needs to be rethought. I'm really interested in what are the presuppositions for this need to rethink in the first place. And as I see it, there are, let's say, two central realms of problems. The first is an epistemological problem. The second is an ethical problem, particularly now in the context of the war in Donbass. With reference to this first problem, so there is this kind of rather persistent epistemological problem with respect to the study of Ukraine. So like nature, knowledge should abhor a vacuum. People should rush to study a country as large, as diverse, as geopolitically significant and pivotal as Ukraine. But relatively speaking, that's not been the story of Ukrainian studies, in particular in Europe, over the past number of years, one might even say the past 50 years or more. And there's also this problem of what psychologists often call perseveration, that is, this resilience of ideas and frameworks that have now been proven demonstrably false. We can see them repeatedly in the context of language politics in Ukraine, regional divisions, even after the dramatic events of 2014, 13, 14, and every day and every month since. These frameworks still stick around. And that's a really big problem. And I think a conference like this one that has us pause, take stock of where these frameworks have taken us, and whether we can just discard them altogether is, I think, a really refreshing opportunity. And I really applaud Andrei and everyone here for prompting us to think like this. The second problem is ethical. Studying a country at war raises serious ethical problems. I'm not sure in our field we've actually confronted them. I don't think I have. I've raised this before. I don't think I've done personally or individually enough to think about how a country at war needs to be studied. Obviously, producing scholarship related to a country at war is always risking providing material for a kind of intellectual warfare that subtends every military conflict. So I think I would maybe pose a question for all of us. Is there, let's say, guidelines? Is there even just a space of conversation we can all have about this particular issue? But the task of rethinking generally always, I think, relates back to this wise adage that that advancements in knowledge are made by answering questions, and discoveries are made by questioning answers. So what I'd like to do is maybe look at a number of answers over the past decades that maybe have represented something of the scholarly conventional wisdom about Ukraine and Ukrainian studies. I think these answers often overlap with one another. Many of them still stick around, so in raising them, I'm not saying that they're gone. But I'm really interested in what they are and how we can pivot from them, refresh them, revise them completely. And the first answer, and this goes back to what I mentioned about that epistemological problem, was that really, with respect to Ukraine, there was no field of study at all, right? That there was no Ukrainian studies, there was no need for it. Serhiy mentioned this with respect to Putin's speech, the God knows why question. Why study Ukraine? It's a sadly persistent idea, as we saw even in 2014 when an article in Foreign Affairs at least temporarily had a title called "There is no Ukraine." This is a persistent issue. I think it reflects this problem that Freud called the blindness of the seeing eye, the willful blindness toward a country that is emerged out of the peripheries of three different empires, often seen as a so-called small nation. Thankfully, I think this is, particularly after 2014, very much an answer that everyone has discredited and that we have, I think, as a collective, responded well to. The second answer is that, well, okay, so if Ukrainian studies is a field, it's a niche field. This one drives me mad. I mean, if one were to actually look, to imagine starting a university course, starting with a blank sheet of paper and reimagining the world, Ukrainian studies would have a very central place in any institution. I mean, we're talking about the study of the largest country within Europe that emerged out of those peripheries of empires because, I would argue, of the power of poetry of all things, not manifestos, not political declarations, but cultural products. That's itself a remarkable thing. And now it's beset by warfare in a very geopolitically strategic part of the world, surrounded by criminogenic, Potemkin kind of polities on either side. Since 2008, there have been 2 wars in the region, 1 revolution, an audacious annexation. Ukrainian studies is not a niche field, it's a critical field. Ukrainian studies is in many respects European studies, and I really like Karl Schlegel's formulation of Ukraine is Europe in miniature. And that's something I think we need to brandish on t-shirts if we have to, and to really exercise this notion that Ukrainian studies is a niche area. And I have to say that some of my Ukrainian colleagues are the first to present this idea. They're constantly surprised that we might be focused on Ukrainian culture in England. And I think it's important, I think it's a sign that we have some work to do with respect to showcasing how the study of Ukraine is not secondary, it's not peripheral, it's not marginal, it's in fact very central. Third answer, well, if Ukraine is an object of study, it's a passive object. I'm always struck by how often Ukraine is figured as an object of knowledge that is very passive. So people act, or forces act upon Ukraine. This is very persistent in realist political discourse. Ukraine is a pawn in various games. Ukrainians themselves on the ground are rarely considered. That is a persistent problem. But if Ukraine is granted agency, let's say, in these political discussions, or if Ukrainians are granted agency, that is, they're looked at as having their own story and that they are characters in their own story, often this agency is cast and described as haphazard. It's sudden, it comes out of nowhere. Over the course of the past few years, we've seen so many headlines that touch upon this topic of a birth of a new nation, that somehow Ukraine is new, or whatever's happening in Ukraine is completely new without much consideration to whether we've actually been here before. When we talked earlier, I think it was Tatiana who mentioned earlier the revolution on granite, which is often forgotten about prior to the Orange Revolution, the Ukraina bez Kuchmy protests that preceded, of course, the Orange Revolution, and then the Maidan itself. I've been in many discussions, as I'm sure all of you have been in certain points in your life, where the activity of Ukrainians in their own political future is discounted. That is, there's not going to be a protest. Ukrainians wouldn't remove a sitting president, or at least force his flight. There's kind of underestimation that has persisted, and that's a problem. This leads me to another issue, and we talked about it a lot today, and that is Ukraine as a borderland. And I completely subscribe to this idea, and I was so excited for the morning presentations in particular that really sparked so much thought and were really rich and full. One worry I have is that there is a kind of fashion for focusing on Ukraine as entangled, as a borderland, as ambivalent and ambiguous. I mean, you can come up, we all can kind of enumerate these various adjectives. The only problem with that sometimes, or hybrid is often one that's used quite frequently. And that's all true to a degree, but Ukraine is also its own center. It is also marked by kind of political and cultural clarity. It's also a bordered land. And so I think in respect to this notion of Ukraine as entangled, yes, it's entangled. But what makes Ukraine so fascinating is that even though it's entangled, it managed to disentangle itself enough to stand on its own 2 feet culturally and politically. That's what makes it so fascinating. So I do think that as we bring this discussion of borderland, of hybridity to the fore with Ukraine, as we should, I think it's worth us constantly reminding ourselves that we need to advocate a kind of structural logic of simultaneity, of a both-and kind of logic, history or Ukrainian studies in 3 dimensions, where we can actually talk about peripheries and post-coloniality, play, carnivalesque exchange, while also being focused on how there is a coherent message in the Ukrainian national project, and that shouldn't be overlooked. So in other words, I would say that to a degree, there are, I think, currents in Ukrainian studies where we look at the country according to a kind of arithmetic, when I think we need something like algebra or at least calculus. Okay, so if Ukraine is studied and has agency, that agency is haphazard. Okay, now when the agency is actually presented as something fairly coherent, I think it's presented often as a very political, Ukraine as a political creature is very foregrounded. So we see a lot of great work on electoral politics, and there's a great deal of focus on political elites. All well and good. But I think those who are focusing on political elites and Ukraine as a political creature need to keep, I think, trumpeting the need for us to be looking much more deeply into Ukrainian society and, as I'll say in just a moment, Ukrainian culture as well. Ukrainian civil society is a kind of proxy state. It's extremely mature. It's constantly underestimated. Whereas Ukraine's political class is more or less inept. That asymmetry, that divergence, is very problematic, and we need to find a way to figure it out. Instead, I think we find little niches and silos of thinking where we focus on political elites and then civil society is something else that others do. I think we need to be more comprehensive and integrate all of those currents together. When we focus on Ukraine as a political creature, we forget its cultural life. And so Barbara just mentioned popular culture. It's an extremely important point. It's a very strange omission. Ukraine owes its political life to culture. It owes its political life to the Duma that Alexander mentioned earlier, to lyric poets that cajoled readers into the national project, to figures like, as he mentioned yesterday, people like Volodymyr Vinnychenko, who straddle these worlds of being both cultural producers and political producers. And the very fact that often Vinnychenko is forgotten in these discussions is symptomatic of the problem of our failure to study and take seriously this cultural world that is so rich. And those in the social sciences and in political science who have an opportunity to present Ukraine, I hope that all of us keep emphasizing the dynamic cultural life that Ukraine has had for centuries, that speaks to the kind of plurality and diversity that we've been addressing today. And in this respect, I think just to kind of conclude a little bit, to leave time for discussion, I want to make a point that goes back to this question of what we do as scholars when the country we study is engaged in war. There is, I think, for those of us who focus on culture, a need to be active in presenting what, and this is kind of following from Michael Oakeshott and Hayden White, this notion of the practical past or practical pasts in history that Hayden White advocates. And there needs to be something of practical culture, practical literary studies, for instance, or cultural studies. Which is why I think in talking about the Slavia Islamica is a terrific intervention. The need for us to look at how cultural discourses have actually shown us ways in which, let's say, civic nationalism is much more entrenched in Ukraine than typical political analyses that we tend to see getting play in various news outlets gives credit for. I'm going to end on a kind of tongue-in-cheek note, I suppose, with respect to even the story of Zelensky's rise. There wasn't really any attempt to look at this question that Yevhen Sverstuk addressed years ago, and that is this ambivalent vein of laughter that courses through the Ukrainian body politic. It's not for nothing that the Ukrainian national idea begins with a joke of a burlesque treatment of an epic poem by Virgil, that is Aeneida by Ivan Kotlяревsky. We talked a bit yesterday about the Cossack inheritance. We tend to focus on the romantic characterization of the Zaporozhian Cossack that comes to us from, in particular, Shevchenko, but then evolves after him. But there's also this neoclassical model, which is very much one of great play, of a lot of subversion, and one need only think of Repin's famous canvas to see that there is a kind of connection of political culture and humor and laughter. The very fact that in Zelensky's story there wasn't much consideration of any kind of cultural penetration into the political sphere is, I think, again, slightly troubling. I understand it, but I think it's symptomatic of the way in which these different areas in Ukrainian studies can be marginalized and dismissed. So with that, I think I'll conclude, and if you have questions or comments of your own to raise, I think this is the space to do it.